Hello everyone. My name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar. That means that I'm the guy that you can come to with all of your Tolkien question needs. If you have a question about The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or The Silmarillion or any of his books really, or just anything about Tolkien in general, including the deeper lore, your crazy theories, all that kind of cool stuff, you can come to me and I will answer them as best that I can. I've been studying the Legendarium for over 30 years, so it's been a passion of mine since my youth. That being said, if you want to ask me a question, you can feel free to ask right in the comments and I will answer you as best I can. But if you want to be featured in a video, all of the questions in the videos are sourced from Quora. So just head on over there. There is a link to my Quora account in the description, as well as my Quora group, the Grey Havens. And you can just ask any question you want there and tag me in it, either by going to my account and hit ask question, or just ask a question about anything Tolkien related, and it's going to recommend to you several people that you could tag in the question, and I guarantee you my face is going to be at or near the top of that list. That being said, let's get into a reading. So let's see. I've decided to read from The Hobbit today, and I'm going to read you a bit of Flies and Spiders, which this is, I remember just this part having such an effect on me when I was about 7 or 8 years old. I think I was 7 when I first read The Hobbit. And it was very visual and very, very real, you know, like I get to see it all. And it's a part that I remember. And whenever I think of The Hobbit, in fact, I think of Bilbo in Mirkwood Forest, taunting spiders invisibly with the One Ring. And then, of course, managing to fight them, and that is where he first gives his sword the name Sting. So let's read you a bit of Flies and Spiders here. Up they all jumped. There, sure enough, not far away, were scores of twinkling lights, and they heard the voices and the laughter quite plainly. They crept slowly towards them in a single line, each touching the back of one in front. When they got near, Thorin said, "No rushing forward this time. No one is to stir from hiding till I say. I shall send Mr. Baggins alone first to talk to them. They won't be frightened of him." What about me of them, thought Bilbo. And anyway, I hope they won't do anything nasty to him. When they got to the edge, the circle of lights, they pushed Bilbo suddenly from behind. Before he had time to slip on his ring, he stumbled forward into the full blaze of the fire and torches. It was no good. Out went all the lights, and complete darkness fell. If it had been difficult collecting themselves before, it was far worse this time. And they simply could not find the Hobbit. Every time they counted themselves, it only made 13. They shouted and called, "Bilbo Baggins, Hobbit, you dratted Hobbit! Hi, Hobbit, confiscate you, where are you?" and other things of that sort, but there was no answer. They were just giving up hope when Dori stumbled across him by sheer luck. In the dark, he fell over what he thought was a log, and he found it was the Hobbit curled up fast asleep. It took a good deal of shaking to wake him, and when he was awake, he was not pleased at all. "I was having such a lovely dream," he grumbled, "all about having a most gorgeous dinner." "Good heavens, he is gone like Bomber," they said. "Don't tell us about dreams. Dream dinners aren't any good, and we can't share them." "They are the best I'm likely to get in this beastly place," he muttered, as he lay down beside the dwarves and tried to get back to sleep and find his dream again. But that was not the last of the lights in the forest. Later, when the night must have been getting old, Killy, who was watching them, came and roused them all again, saying, "There's a regular blaze of light begun not far away. Hundreds of torches and many fires must have been lit suddenly and by magic, and hark to the singing and the harps." After lying and listening for a while, they found they could not resist the desire to go nearer and try once more to get help. Up they got again, and this time the result was disastrous. The feast that they now saw was greater and more magnificent than before, and at the head of a long line of feasters sat a woodland king, with a crown of leaves upon his golden hair, very much as Bomber had described the figure in his dream. The elvish folk were passing bowls from hand to hand and across the fires, and some were harping and many were singing. Their gleaming hair was twined with flowers, green and white gems glinted in their collars and their belts, and their faces and their songs were filled with mirth. Loud and clear and fair were those songs, and out stepped Thorin into their midst. Dead silence fell in the middle of a word. Out went all the light. The fires leaped up in black smoke. Ashes and cinders were in the eyes of the dwarves, and the wood was filled again with their clamor and their cries. Bilbo found himself running round and round, as he thought, and calling, Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, Gloin, Filly, Killy, Bomber, Bifur, Bofer, Dwalin, Balin, Thorin Oakenshield, while people he could not see or feel were doing all the same all around him, with an occasional Bilbo thrown in. But the cries of the others got steadily further and fainter, and though after a while it seemed to him that they changed to yells and cries for help in the far distance, all noise at last died right away, and he was left alone in complete silence and darkness. That was one of his most miserable moments, but he soon made up his mind that it was no good trying to do anything till day came, with some little light, and quite useless to go blundering about tiring himself out with no hope of any breakfast to revive him. So he sat himself down with his back to a tree, and not for the last time fell to thinking of his far-distant hobbit hole with its beautiful pantries. He was deep in thought of bacon and eggs and toast and butter when he felt something touch him. Something like a strong, sticky string was against his left hand, and when he tried to move he found that his legs were already wrapped in the same stuff, so that when he got up he fell over. Then the great spider, who had been busy tying him up while he dozed, came from behind him and came at him. He could only see the thing's eyes, but he could feel its hairy legs, as it struggled to wind its abominable threads round and round him. It was lucky that he had come to his senses in time. Soon he would not have been able to move at all. As it was, he had a desperate fight before he got free. He beat the creature off with his hands. It was trying to poison him to keep him quiet, as small spiders do to flies, until he remembered his sword and drew it out. Then the spider jumped back, and he had time to cut his legs loose. After that, it was his turn to attack. The spider evidently was not used to things that carried such stings at their sides, or it would have hurried away quicker. Bilbo came at it before it could disappear, and stuck it with his sword right in the eyes. Then it went mad and leaped and danced and flung out its legs in horrible jerks, until he killed it with another stroke. And then he fell down and remembered nothing more for a long while. There was the usual dim grey light of the forest day about him when he came to his senses. The spider lay dead beside him, and his sword blade was stained black. Somehow the killing of the giant spider, all alone by himself in the dark, without the help of the wizard or the dwarves, or of anyone else, made a great difference to Mr. Baggins. He felt a different person, and much fiercer and bolder in spite of an empty stomach. As he wiped his sword on the grass, and put it back into its sheath, "I will give you a name," he said to it, "and I shall call you Sting." So from there, he runs into many more spiders. He's invisible for a lot of it. He sings to them and makes fun of them and gets them angry and throws rocks at them, and he kills more with his sword. But that's the origin of Sting there. Interesting thing there about the Elven King, Thranduil as we know him. A lot of the debate about the looks of certain characters comes from Tolkien just not really describing them all that well or at all, and one of them is Legolas. And Legolas, in our vision, we see Legolas and we kind of think of him as a blonde elf. A lot of people just close their eyes, think Legolas, and they might see Orlando Bloom in the Lord of the Rings films and even the Hobbit films for some reason. But then there are the old guard who were there before the movies who would say, well, there's no reason to believe he was blonde. They never mentioned any kind of hair color for Legolas. He could have had brown hair or black hair or red hair or anything, right? Although blonde Legolas was around before that because of the Ralph Bakshi film from the 70s. He was blonde in that, where he was replacing Glorfindel. But anyway, the reason I bring it up is because to me it seems likely that Legolas might have had blonde hair, because his father did. It was described there that he had golden hair. Of course, just because your father has blonde hair does not mean that you will have blonde hair. We don't know who Legolas's mother was. She could have been a dark-haired elf, or she could have been blonde as well. We don't know. But that is to say that there was a description of Thranduil in The Hobbit, even though they did not use it. So there is reason to believe that Legolas may be blonde, because Thranduil was described as blonde in that passage. And the thing about it is, obviously, like I said, that doesn't matter that much. He could still be dark-haired, but there is a precedent. They didn't use the name Thranduil, which even led to somebody asking me at one point, do we know that was Thranduil? Could it have been a different Elven King? And of course it was him. But it's just interesting that Thranduil is a character in The Hobbit, and he's described as having blonde hair, but he's never named. And then he's not really a character in The Lord of the Rings. He's never in any of the scenes, so to speak, but he's mentioned many times directly by his name, King Thranduil. So it's just sort of interesting the way that worked out. There are only 2 named elves in all of The Hobbit. One was the butler, Thranduil's butler, whose name escapes me right now, but then the other was Elrond. Every other elf is just unnamed. Anyway, guys, we're going to get into your questions. We have 14 questions to get through today, so let's start with this first one. And here we start with a question about Legolas. In The Lord of the Rings, why is Legolas called Legolas Greenleaf by Gandalf? To put it simply, it is a common thing in The Lord of the Rings to refer to the person by their name and then the translation of their name shortly after this, or some sort of other epithet. Elves don't really have last names or family names. Sometimes there are house names, which is sort of similar, but not all too often. So Legolas means green leaf. It's derived from leg, which means green, and golas, which means a collection of leaves or just foliage. In Quenya, he would be called Lycolasa, which is what the other Legolas, Legolas of Gondolin, renamed himself when he sailed to the west and lived in Eressëa in what possibly maybe a non-canon story because it was the Book of Lost Tales. But we see this sort of naming a lot, such as saying Sauron the Abhorred or Morgoth the Dark Lord. Sauron means abhorred, Morgoth literally means dread tyrant, which is synonymous with Dark Lord. And of course, we see many epithets used in conjunction with names. It's not always a direct translation of their names, but sometimes it is. Green leaves. It's very significant to the Woodland Realm that Legolas was a prince of. It was once called Greenwood the Great before it became Mirkwood, and after that it would be renamed the Forest of Green Leaves. So it's sort of just not just saying this is what Legolas means, but that he's from the Woodland Realm and that he's important there, that he's the prince. Anyway, good question. Next one. Okay, so here's a question that came in from Cherry Poppins, who asks, in The Lord of the Rings, what would happen if Denethor had seen King Theoden and the Rohirrim arrive in Gondor and answer the call for aid and decided not to burn himself alive and was alive to greet Aragorn and his friends inside Minas Tirith later? So, I mean, I guess he would have used the Palantir for that because he did have that, and he could potentially, using the Palantir, have seen that Rohan was on their way. But keep in mind that he probably did see that in his Palantir. He probably was aware. Even if he didn't see it in the Palantir, there's a good reason to believe that Denethor knew that Rohan were on their way, and it really didn't matter to him. He didn't think that it mattered very much at all. Gandalf was facing the Witch King when Rohan arrived, and the Witch King suddenly decided that he had bigger fish to fry, and he left the gate. So Gandalf was actually going to chase him down. He was going to pursue his foe, but he was stopped by Pippin, who gave him the news of Denethor's madness and his attempt at burning himself alive along with Faramir. So Gandalf goes to ride up to see what he could do, and along the way he meets Imrahil, and the wizard tells Imrahil that he is now in charge in the absence of both Denethor and Faramir. It is around this time, while Gandalf is speaking with Imrahil, that we also see that word of Rohan's arrival is spreading like wildfire throughout the city. While Rohan is not mentioned specifically when Gandalf arrives at the Citadel, I believe we are meant to understand that news may have already reached there. Even if it didn't, it really didn't matter. Denethor was deep in the throes of madness. If he had been told that Rohan had arrived, he would have probably said, well, they'll die too. Denethor's use of the Palantir was not necessarily a bad thing. As the sovereign in Gondor, it was his right to use the Anor Stone, but he had been foolish to not consider that the Ithil Stone may have been recovered by Sauron. In his madness, Denethor says a lot of truths, that Sauron's armies are vast, and that they are not only armies that are pouring out of Mordor, but also out of the eastern lands and the ships from the south. Essentially, making contact with Sauron allowed Sauron to flood Denethor with imagery about how powerful and how unstoppable he was, sort of pro-Mordor propaganda, so to speak. So Denethor, in this scene, he reveals his wish, his desire to rule the city in peace and to leave his reign to a son that is no wizard's pupil. The second was denied to him because Boromir died, and he believes that Gandalf has stolen the heart of his son Faramir, and he wishes to usurp him and have Faramir or Aragorn rule as his puppet. This alone means that, regardless of any change of situation with knowing about Rohan or whatever, he would never welcome Aragorn. So he's already lost in despair at the death of Boromir, and he's seeing no path to victory. He has decided to choose the method and time of his own death, something that Gandalf tells him he's not supposed to do. Thankfully, Gandalf manages to save Faramir. The only thing that really could have saved Denethor was to maybe imprison him until such a time that Sauron was defeated and his madness may pass. But considering that there was a battle raging around them and that Gandalf was very concerned that he's up here arguing with the steward instead of out there on the battlefield fighting, he really didn't have the time or the opportunity to sort of arrest Denethor, and he didn't really have the authority to do that either. And Denethor wasn't just standing there like ready to be taken in. He was zipping around, waving a knife around at anyone that came near him. So Gandalf already felt that this escapade was what stopped him from saving Theoden. He didn't really have time to coddle the mad steward. So I really think that in the end, he may have already known that Rohan was on their way, and I don't think it mattered. He was like, it doesn't matter. Sauron's going to win. We're all going to die. We're all going to burn. We might as well do it on our own terms. Next question. Okay, so quick we get to it. Here's the question from the thumbnail. Why was Sauron, as the Necromancer, unable to return Morgoth back to life and restore him to his old position, like he did with the Nazgul, or perhaps he could have but didn't want to be demoted and forced to take his orders? Okay, so there's a few assumptions that are in the question, which are pretty understandable, so let's unravel it a little bit. The first assumption made is that Sauron, as a necromancer, is concerned with the raising of the dead. This is an understandable mistake to make, as our current modern usage of necromancer is a wizard that raises the dead, such as zombies and ghosts and the like. In the case of J.R.R. Tolkien, though, he was going with an older definition of necromancer. The word has gone through a lot of different meanings. It has evolved over the years, and someone who... Originally, it was someone who merely communes with the dead, or could speak with the dead. We would call them a medium now. Sauron, though, is more concerned with the manipulation of souls. So necromancy in Tolkien's work, in his world, is called Morgul magic, and it involves manipulation or control of souls. This leads to the creation of fell mockeries of God's creatures, such as orcs, which are mockeries of elves, trolls, which are mockeries of ents, dragons, which are corruptions of existing fauna, werewolves, which are souls transplanted into wolves, vampires. He never really explained that one. I have theories, but I'll get to that in a second, actually. One other method is also preventing the soul of a mortal from passing from the circles of the world by binding them with magic. Sauron used the rings of power controlled by the One Ring to create wraiths. So the Nazgul weren't men who died but were resurrected by a necromancy. What they were men that were denied death. They were basically anchored to the world, and even as their bodies withered and died and they existed only in this wraith world, they still could not pass from the circles of the world until the power of the One Ring was broken. So, and then these wraiths themselves could create lesser wraiths using Morgul blades. That's what almost happened to Frodo. So it's strongly hinted that the Barrow-wights as well were created in a similar fashion. So while Sauron is involved with the undead, he cannot actually raise the dead once someone is gone, they're gone from the circles of the world. They're beyond the reach of Sauron. It is possible that Sauron may be able to maybe animate a corpse by putting a captured soul into it, and that might be what the vampires were, but we don't hear about him specifically doing that. The second assumption that was made is that Morgoth is dead. He's not dead. He was just flung far beyond the circles of the world. Essentially, to put it in very simple terms, Morgoth was yeeted out into space to hopefully never return. Though Tolkien did at least at one point imagine that he may return in the future, Morgoth cannot die. He's one of the Ainur. He's an angel. He's the only being that would be capable of unmaking one of the Ainur would be Iluvatar, God himself. But even this would not do, because so much of Morgoth's power was put into Arda, that's the earth, that if he was fully destroyed, so too would the world be fully destroyed. So it's beyond Sauron's ability to bring Morgoth back into the world, though the possibility of his return was written, at which case he will engage in a final battle and he will be destroyed at the end, and that will cause the end of the world, and then the world will be remade. Okay, next question. Okay, so this one came in from okay, I'm going to try and say this right because he left me a note about the pronunciation of his last name, and this is one of our channel members as well, Evangelos, and I think it's Paschopoulos. I believe that's the way I'm supposed to say it, Paschopoulos. I hope I said it right. I at least made an effort to read his note on pronunciation and understand it as best as I can. But so here's the question: how do elven magic or powers work in Tolkien's works? For example, where do Galadriel and Elrond's powers derive from, and what makes some elves more powerful than others? So the funny thing about elf magic is that whenever you bring it up, the elves kind of have no idea what you're talking about. After demonstrating her mirror, Galadriel asks Sam if he's satisfied. Sam had said that he wanted to see some elf magic, and she asked if does this count? Is this elf magic to you? And it did, although he was a little upset about what he saw in the mirror. When the Fellowship got all their gifts from Galadriel, the hobbits, everybody actually got these magnificent elven cloaks, and they had some magical properties, but they asked the elves, are these cloaks magic? And the reaction was confusion. The elves don't know what they mean by that. So elves don't see themselves as performing magic. They obviously know what magic is. They are aware of wizards and sorcerers and necromancers. However, what they do is just their own nature. So what to them are natural crafts and normal things to do, to others is magic, because it seems impossible or wondrous. But to answer the question more directly, as it isn't, they just do it. It seems that the greatest feats of elf magic involve putting a bit of themselves into their work. A good example of this is seen with some of the great crafts of Gondolin, the weapons that glow with a blue fire when goblins, or also called orcs, are near. This is said to be the elvish animosity to the foul mockery of their own form put into their weapons. In more esoteric cases, such as Galadriel's mirror, it may just involve special water, a special basin, a prayer, a trick that she might have picked up from Melian when she lived in Doriath. It's hard to get one's head around it, but what is to us magic and a magic artifact to an elf may just be a tool. Then it works exactly as it's designed to work. So the power of various elves, it differs because it's akin to people having different levels of skill. Not every craftsman has the same skills. So when you're looking at an Elrond who is primarily a healer, or Galadriel whose magic is very tied up in the preservation of her realm, they're just really good at what they're doing. And if you were to ask Elrond, well, how did you flood the Ford of Bruin? And he says, well, because as the Lord of the realm, everything here confers to my will. And if I say the Ford should be flooded, it should be flooded. And that's how Elrond would likely explain it, you know? Okay, next question. Okay, so here's a question that came in from Christian Morrow, who asks, were the rock giants that dueled with each other in The Hobbit actually derived from ancient legend, or did Tolkien dream them up himself? So, no, Tolkien did not create the concept of giants. There's lots of types of giants in folklore, and giants in The Hobbit were neither made of stone, nor were they dueling with each other. That's important to note. Tolkien once had both giants and ogres in early versions of his work. The main villain, Melko, who would be later called Melkor or Morgoth, even married an ogre, and they had a son named Gothmog. Ogres got completely worked out of his drafts. He got rid of them, but giants remained, though they went through several changes. Tolkien envisioned there being two different types of giants, the giants of the wood and the giants of the mountains. As he evolved his linguistics, Tolkien came to use the word ent to refer to giants, which is just the old English word that means giant. The giants of the wood became tree ents, and the giants of the mountain became stone ents. They were all evil or nefarious at this stage. Treebeard was originally a minion of Saruman. However, as he decided to base Treebeard off of his friend C.S. Lewis, the character and the tree ents in general went under a big literary change, and the giants that lived around trees became giants that protected trees. He came to just call them ents, as the stone giants became unimportant in the overall legendarium. So the stone giants in The Hobbit may be in universe the same as the orphaned stone ents that Tolkien once envisioned, but out of universe, it's important to remember that The Hobbit was not always connected to all the other stories, though he made various references throughout it that make it very easy to connect it to his greater work. Revisions were made to make it more in line as well, but the earliest Hobbit drafts even mention Sauron more directly, but he still saw it as just a reference. So all this to say, Peter Jackson kind of took a lot of literal liberties. He took it too literally. The tree ents are not walking trees, though they have some tree-ish qualities when standing very still. They're not trees. The stone giants aren't made out of rocks. They're just big giants that live in the mountains. So in The Hobbit, they were not dueling, they were just playing catch with boulders, and they were not evil, but they were dangerous to be around due to not being all too aware of their surroundings, and they're chucking boulders around. That's very dangerous. Gandalf even mentioned later that he planned to go back and speak to them to get one of the more decent giants to block up the entrance to Goblin Town. Okay, next question. Okay, so here it is. If Sauron had never made the ring, would he have been able to return regardless of how many times he was defeated, or would there be a point at which he was too weak to take physical form? So I think this is a very good question, and the answer is kind of both. Sauron's ability to pull himself back together and return would continue if the one was not destroyed, or if it never existed at all. Making the ring was a mistake, as it gave his enemies an opportunity to eventually rob him of so much power that he can't pull himself together again, and he's basically just an angry wind. If Sauron had not made this mistake, though, he'd still come back weaker. We see this with the Akalabeth, which robbed him of his ability to appear beautiful. And his defeat by Gil-galad and Elendil, when he was not fully recovered from the Akalabeth, made it so that it took him a very long time to put himself back together again, and not even completely. Gollum describes Sauron's physical form as missing a finger. Now, there is no reason that Sauron, as a shapeshifter from the first age, would lose a finger and not be able to just grow it back in a new form, unless he had grown weaker. However, his enemies also grew weaker, and this is why the important thing here, the kingdoms of men and the kingdoms of dwarves were in decline, as well as the lifespan of the Dunedain, that was in decline as well. The elves were slowly leaving Middle-earth, and the ones that stayed would eventually fade. A weakened Sauron would still dominate over the weakened and diminished free peoples, so it's possible that before he got to the point where he was too weak to continue, he would just win. Okay, next question. Okay, so this one comes in from Tenzin Tulutsang. I hope I said it right. How many Maiar of Gandalf and Saruman's level would it take to launch a successful attack on Mordor at its height of power? So the answer is a very big and emphatic, it doesn't matter. At the height of Mordor's power, they were successfully attacked by a force that had 0 Maiar spirits. Just some very tough and brave men and elves. It wouldn't matter if it took 1 Maiar like Gandalf, or all 5 of the wizards, or if Eonwe came with an entire host. Sauron's final defeat had absolutely nothing to do with a show of force, and everything to do with the destruction of the One Ring. The One Ring, of course, was not destroyed by the mighty, but by hobbits. And even in this case, the one that actually destroyed it was destroyed himself along with it, and his presence there was the result of being spared and pitied multiple times over. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that aspect of the story in another question towards the end of the video. So The Lord of the Rings is not a story about power levels. It's a story about the virtues of patience and pity and mercy, along with the bravery and the willingness to sacrifice. That's what wins. So it has nothing to do with Maya. Okay, next question. Why did movie Gandalf make it appear to Pippin that he was experiencing what exists in the Beyond for the first time, when he's essentially an angel that came from the Beyond in Valinor? It's because of the nature of what Gandalf is, beyond him just merely being an angel. First, I have to correct an error in the question. This is important. Valinor is not part of the Beyond. It's a country on the continent of Aemon, which is part of the Undying Lands. It used to reside just to the west of Middle-earth, across the Sundering Sea, but it was separated by Iluvatar, that's God, in the Second Age. It is still part of the world, with a capital W, as a whole, or rather, we would say the circles of the world, but it can only be sailed to by elves and Maiar. Now, as for Gandalf, he is not just a Maiar, but he's an incarnate one. Part of becoming incarnate, which means given flesh, and traveling to Middle-earth, it means giving up a lot of his memories, actually, as the Valar wished for the wizards, the Astari, to be unburdened by such memories to better focus on their task. Faramir mentions this when he recounts that he knows Gandalf's true name, Olorin, and mentions that he told him he was of the West that is forgotten. And in that passage, it's West with a capital W, the West. Aside from that, when Gandalf died at the peak of Xiraxigil, he did not pass to Valinor or to Mandos, but rather beyond the circles of the world, to the void where Iluvatar was. He was sent back because his task was not complete. And as Saruman had turned away from his position, Gandalf had to step in and become, as he put it, Saruman as he should have been. As one of the Ainur, as a Maya, Gandalf, of course, entered Arda, the world, after it was created. And he had been in the void before this, what you call beyond. But this was all a very, very long time ago, long before the First Age, before the awakening of the elves, before the trees, before the marring of the world, before the spring of Arda. Movie Gandalf is stepping outside of his bounds a little bit. In the book, he spoke about this experience, not to Pippin, but to Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, and he said that he went by paths he will not speak of. Though with Pippin, he basically let the cat out of the bag and said, here's what happens when you die. It made for a good moment, though. I don't begrudge Peter Jackson this, because it was a really, really good scene, and I think a lot of people just have this sort of idea that Gandalf doesn't very much like Pippin, and I think that, like, if you read the book, and even if you watch the movie from a certain point of view, you can see that Gandalf and Pippin actually have a very special relationship. And he didn't tell anybody else what happens when you die, but he told it to Pippin, and it really got him in a very, like right here, it got him, and he said, that doesn't sound so bad. And Gandalf looked at him and says, no, it's not so bad at all. And I felt that was actually very Tolkien-ish, even though it wasn't a scene from Tolkien's work. It was very Tolkien-ish because the whole point was that dying is natural, dying happens, and it's not so bad. So yeah, that made sense to me. Okay, next question. Okay, so this one came in from the Enlightened, who asked, what did Sauron do when he was bored, when nothing of note was happening? So, believe it or not, there was no indication that Sauron has ever been bored. There's a good reason to believe that he's never bored. While many of the Ainur had hobbies and interests to occupy their minds, I mean, Gandalf took up smoking, Sauron is an interesting case. If Sauron were to be diagnosed by a clinical psychiatrist in our modern era, he may be found to have what is known as obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. So this is a bit more specific than just OCD, or obsessive-compulsive disorder. OCPD has obsessiveness and compulsion sort of baked into the person's personality. Somebody who has OCD is aware that they have OCD, and they're aware that what they're doing is unusual, but they can't help themselves. Whereas somebody with OCPD just thinks, no, this is what everybody should do. Why aren't you doing it? So, and I have a friend who has OCPD, and he just thinks everybody else is nuts. So, there you go. That being said, Sauron's obsession was order, and his mind was bent on this since his creation. He was made to love order and to detest chaos. But due to his untreated mental illness, he came to have a rather broad and skewed vision of what constitutes chaos and what constitutes order. When Gandalf rejects the One Ring from Frodo, he says that he does not wish to become like Sauron, as taking on Sauron's power will make him obsessed over his own mission of good over evil, to the point where in trying to do good, he will do evil. Gandalf the Black may see freedom as evil, as people not under control, his direct control, are apt to do evil, so he must control them through order. He will become like Sauron. So Sauron doesn't see himself as the villain. He sees himself as the complete hero here. He wishes to bring Middle-earth, which he sees as wildly chaotic, to order under his heel. Every minute of every hour of every day, his mind is bent on this. He's completely obsessed, and it dominates his entire personality. He does not get distracted by irrelevant tasks, nor does he become bored. Sauron is laser focused and obsessed over what he perceives to be his calling. He doesn't do anything else. There was a period of time in the early Second Age, after the War of Wrath, when Sauron spent some time trying to heal Middle-earth and do good works, but he lapsed back into evil. He could not shake the thought that he needed to save Middle-earth from chaos. So I would say that there's always something of note happening. His mind is always bent towards that, and he's never bored. Next question. What is the origin and meaning of the name Sauron in The Lord of the Rings? What does it mean in the Sindarin language? So Sauron, the word Sauron, it's not actually Sindarin, it's the other Elvish language, it's Quenya. It means the abhorred. Though there is a Sindarin analog, Sauron was a name that was given to the Maya known as Maiar, which means the admirable, by the elves. They called him Sauron because they hated him. The root of Sauron in Quenya is sometimes disputed, but it seems to be derived from the primitive Quendian Saurond, which means detestable. Now, in developing the languages of Quenya and Sindarin, which come from primitive Quenya, the elves took different venues on how to pronounce that initial sound. Quenya stuck with the S, so Saurond became detestable. And dropping the D on the end, Sauron, detested, abhorred. In Sindarin, it became a th sound, the TH, and the Sindarin root became Thaur. The root of the Sindar elves' name for Sauron, Gorthaur. That's what they call him. That's what he's called in Sindarin. Gor is horror or dread, and then of course Thaur is hatred, so it's detested horror or terrible dread, which if you transliterated that into Quenya, it would be Norsus. So Gorthaur also alludes to the character's previous iteration in writing as Thu the Necromancer. So in the Third Age, Quenya was not spoken very much in Middle-earth, and Sindarin was way more popular. However, the name Sauron stuck around much more than Gorthaur, though many Sindarin-speaking communities, such as Gondor, don't even refer to him by his name or anything. They just call him the enemy. So, as the historical records, which is the Silmarillion, were written in Quenya, the surviving memories of the Elder Days were overwhelmingly referring to him as Sauron rather than Gorthaur, and as Gorthaur was not a broad Sindar term, but was specific to Beleriand, which was destroyed, this also led to the name becoming less favorable. Okay, next question. How was the One Ring from the Lord of the Rings made for the movies in the real world? So there was actually no one ring in the movie. There were actually 40 prop rings that played the part for the film. The creator of these prop rings was a famed Danish jeweler named Jens Hansen. He was hired by Weta Workshop to create the various props used to make the One Ring. The actual rings were made in different sizes because they had to be worn by different characters or held in different size hands and to appear differently in different shots. This also included one very large prop ring, like about yay big, that was known as the hero ring because it was a hero prop, a large version of a prop. And that was used for a lot of the close-ups of the ring where there was a lot of detail needed, such as the reflection of the Fellowship in the ring, or for perspective shots, such as the ring being in the foreground when Frodo drops it at Carithros. So the rings were actually made out of silver, and then they were gold-plated. It took Jens Hansen 3 days to polish the hero ring to make it shine properly. Sadly, Hansen actually passed away from cancer before the release of the films, but his props were used in all 6 of Peter Jackson's films. So it's just sad that he never got to see his rings on the big screen like that, but that's cancer for you. It's just a terrible, awful illness. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. How could Gandalf have handled Denethor differently? So, in my opinion, Gandalf's one error in dealing with Denethor was not anything that he said to Denethor, but what he said to Pippin, actually. So Pippin is a rather young and very inquisitive hobbit who was known to occasionally run his mouth, and Gandalf feared what Pippin may say to Denethor about Boromir and upset the steward, and he told him to keep his silence. Of course, Pippin did no such thing. This did, in the end, work out for the best because Pippin, who was honest before the steward, did not hold his tongue, gained the trust of the steward, and also became close to Faramir, whom he saved by fetching Gandalf, as we mentioned earlier. This, of course, leads to Aragorn becoming king. However, the issue that Gandalf could have avoided was to not try to stifle what Pippin may say. What Gandalf did not know when he made this request to Pippin to not mention anything about Boromir specifically to the steward is they were being watched and listened to by Denethor through the Palantir, the Honor Stone. This Palantir that Denethor had used to know a great many things that he otherwise would not have. Shortly before his own death, Denethor even called out Gandalf for telling Pippin not to speak, and it played into an already long distrust that he had for the wizard, who he believed to wish to rule Gondor through his puppet Thorongil, which was later revealed to be Aragorn. In trying to prevent Denethor from hearing an upsetting truth, he played into the steward's paranoia and distrust of him. So that was sort of the one, I would say, the one error that Gandalf made in dealing with Denethor. Okay, next question. Okay, so this one came in from Sam Berggren, who asks, Ainu Lindala, Moreover, their shape comes from the knowledge of the visible world rather than of the world itself. What comment does this line make on the nature of Tolkien's world, and what other forms could the Valar have taken? So, what he's saying here is that when the Valar take what is referred to, or the Ainur in general take what is referred to as shape and hue, or fauna, as it is referred, it is not real. When referring to the bodies of the Ainur, we call them fauna. But when referring to the bodies of the children of Iluvatar, men and elves and such, we call them hroa. And there is an important distinction. Men and elves are born into their bodies. They have their bodies for their entire life. Elves being able to exist for points as their other half, the Fea, or the spirit. But they are half when they are just souls. They're missing something. Our bodies are real, and they're a part of us, and they are of the world. Now, the bodies of the Ainur are not real. They are of knowledge of the world. They took these bodies before they entered the world. But the Ainur saw visions of what Iluvatar's children would look like, and they fashioned themselves shape and hue, a body to appear like them, just in greater degrees of majesty and splendor. And Ainu without a fauna is not incomplete. They are as made by Iluvatar. They use these bodies as raiment, as clothes, and as you could take off your clothes and not be lessened, so they could cast aside these forms, and they made them based on their knowledge of the world, but it's not an essential part of them. And it is also mentioned that they could do this, and they could also take onto themselves other forms that are of their own thought, forms of majesty and dread. And I think that basically, to answer the second part of the question, what other forms could they take? Forms of majesty and dread, you kind of have to use your imagination in that sense, because Tolkien's very not specific about it. And this brings us to our final question. What did Gandalf mean when he said true courage is not about knowing when to take a life, but when to spare one? Okay, so if you consider the scene he's talking about, Bilbo was considering outright killing Gollum in The Hobbit, and he's recounting this to Frodo. So Bilbo in The Hobbit was at one point, now realizing that the ring that he had found made him invisible, was considering just stabbing Gollum and being done with it. Then he thought to himself, that's not a fair fight. It wouldn't be self-defense. It's cold-blooded murder. Bilbo was invisible. Bilbo had a sword. Gollum was terrible, and maybe he deserved death, but he was on the ground weeping. He was pathetic. Bilbo did not consider stabbing Gollum out of bravery. He considered it out of fear. He greatly feared Gollum, and he saw an opportunity to easily ensure his own safety. He was presented with an easy choice to end Gollum and therefore alleviate the fear he had of Gollum, but he chose mercy. And I spoke about this early. This is the most important aspect of The Lord of the Rings, started in The Hobbit. Patience, pity, and mercy. And he did that because he was brave. It took more courage to stay his hand than it would have to stab in the dark, unseen, and unarmed foe. Anyway, that was the final question. And I want to thank you guys for watching the video. If you have gotten through the entire video, if you're still watching, you must have enjoyed it. So, click the subscribe button if you haven't already, and consider clicking the join button and becoming a member. You will get to see all of the videos several days early, as well as some other perks such as some emotes that we have and a loyalty badge. And of course, we're going to show our current members on the screen. Shout out to all of you guys. You are amazing. You are what makes this channel work. That being said, I will see you guys next time.